Okay, today we're diving into a really fascinating modern framework for interpreting scripture. It's all based on the source material, Induction and Illustration, which lays out this systematic way to engage with sacred texts, for our modern 21st century world. So let's get into it and see how it all works. At the heart of all this is a huge question, one that people have been wrestling with forever, right? How can ancient wisdom from texts that are centuries old, still be a practical guide for us today with all the complexities of the modern world? I mean, that's the big challenge this whole framework is trying to tackle. So, what's the answer it offers? Well, the methodology we're looking at is called the BioIslam approach, and it's really important to get this. It's not presenting itself as a new religion or anything like that. Think of it more like a new lens, a structured, Quran-led way of thinking that's all about bridging that gap between timeless principles and our modern understanding. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at this new interpretive lens. Then we'll break down the two main phases, Quranic induction and illustrating principles. After that, we'll see where it fits in the grand scheme of things, talk about the myth of objectivity, and wrap up with its vision for the future. All right, let's kick things off with the absolute core idea here. The framework is described as Quran-led. Now, that's a really important distinction because it's not Quran only. What that means is the Quran is the number one primary source, the final authority. But, and this is key, it doesn't just throw out all the post-Quranic literature. Not at all. Instead, it wants to re-engage with it, but in a totally new way. And the whole thing really boils down to this two-step process. Super simple. Step 1, induction. You pull out the core principles directly from the Quran. Step 2, illustration. You then take those principles and use them to look at and reevaluate all the texts that came after the Quran. It's a very clear sequence. Principles first, then you apply them. That's it. Okay, let's zoom in on phase 1, Quranic induction. You can think of this as the engine that drives the entire framework. The whole point here is to go deeper than just a surface reading. It's about extracting those deep, underlying ethical and moral principles that are woven all through the text. So the fancy term for this process is induction, or in Arabic, istinbat. And this isn't some vague, fuzzy concept. It's defined very precisely as the process of pulling out what the framework calls latent principles, or LPs for short. Think of these as the foundational ideas that are always there, bubbling under the surface of the Quran, even if they aren't spelled out in one single verse. And the source material really makes a point to show this is based on solid research, tying it back to traditional concepts like istinbat. So, what do you get at the end of this induction process? Well, the framework suggests that after you've pulled out dozens of these latent principles, you do another round of induction on those. And what emerges are 5 core concepts. They're called the 5 inner pillars: intentions, empathy, justice, harmony, and potentiality. These are basically presented as the essential moral compass that you get straight from the Quran. Now, this is super important. These inner pillars are not supposed to replace the 5 traditional outer pillars of Islam that everyone knows, the declaration of faith, prayer, charity, fasting, and pilgrimage. Not at all. The idea is that they supplement them. They add this internal ethical layer to the external acts of worship. Okay, so once you have those latent principles and inner pillars locked in, they become your main tool for phase 2. And that's all about illustrating those principles by going back and re-engaging with all that post-Quranic literature, like the Hadith collections. And this is where the rubber really meets the road. Those latent principles from phase 1, they now act like a filter, an ethical and thematic filter. You run the huge collections of Hadith, the sayings and actions of the Prophet, through this filter. The goal is to reevaluate how authentic they are, but not just by looking at the chain of narrators, but by looking at the actual content. So, after you run everything through this filter, you end up with 2 buckets. In one bucket, you've got what the framework calls good hadith. These are the stories and sayings that line up perfectly with the Quran's latent principles. And in the other bucket, you get something called dark matter. These are the narrations that just don't fit. They're incompatible with those core principles. And that dark matter is then set aside as potentially inauthentic. This really shows you how cautious the approach is. It's all about minimizing risk. The motto is simple: when in doubt, cut it out. The thinking behind it is that the danger of a false positive, accidentally accepting something fake as real, is way, way worse than the risk of a false negative, especially when the Quran itself has all the depth you need. So, the big question is, where does this approach fit in with everything else? In this next part, we're going to see how it stacks up against other major schools of thought and how it tries to carve out its own middle path. And this table here breaks it down really nicely. On one side, you have traditional Islam, which generally treats the established collection of hadith as unchallengeable. Then, way on the other side, you've got the Quran-only movements, who just reject everything after the Quran. BioIslam tries to find a spot right in the middle. It's Quran-led, meaning it uses the Quran's principles to sift through all that other knowledge, but it never lets that other knowledge change what the Quran says. Yeah, the framework uses that old saying, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," to really drive this home. The argument is that the Quran-only folks, by tossing out all post-Quranic literature, risk losing some really valuable wisdom. This induction illustration method is all about trying to be more precise, carefully draining the dirty bathwater, so to speak, while making sure you keep the baby, the valuable insights that actually do align with the Quran. Okay, now we're getting into the really deep philosophical stuff. This framework takes on a massive assumption that's been around forever in scriptural interpretation, this idea of pure objectivity. It makes a bold claim. All interpretation is, at its core, subjective, period. So to get this, we need to know two key terms. First is exegesis. That's the idea that you're just pulling the meaning out of a text, totally unbiased. The other term is eisegesis. That's when you're reading your own values and ideas into the text. For centuries, the claim has always been, we're just doing exegesis. But this framework comes along and says, hang on, is that even possible? The core argument is pretty simple, really. No one operates in a vacuum. Think about the great, brilliant imams from centuries ago who put together so much of the tradition. They were absolute geniuses, incredibly dedicated. But they were also human beings, products of their time and their culture. Of course, they were influenced by their own worldviews and the situations they were in while they were sorting through mountains of information. And that leads to a pretty stunning conclusion. That gap we imagine between pure exegesis and biased eisegesis, it's an illusion. The framework basically argues that what we've often called pure interpretation was actually an interpretation deeply shaped by the personal and cultural realities of the people doing the interpreting. Like the source material says so cleverly, mind the gap, there isn't one. And if you want a perfect example of this in action, the framework points right to the doctrine of abrogation. This was a tool that classical scholars came up with to deal with parts of the text that seemed to contradict each other. But in some extreme cases, it was used to argue that a hadith, a saying of the prophet, could actually cancel out a verse from the Quran itself. I mean, that's a pretty clear example of a subjective interpretive tool being created to solve a problem. So all of this brings us to the final and maybe most exciting part of this whole method. It's not meant to be a static, one-and-done solution. The whole thing is designed to be a living, breathing process, something that every generation can take part in. And what's really interesting is how the framework argues this dynamic nature actually mirrors how the Quran itself was revealed. I mean, it wasn't just dropped down as one big book, right? It came in bite-sized chunks over 23 years. The message evolved and adapted to real-world situations as they happened. It was like a live stream of guidance. So the big takeaway here is that this process is never finished. It's meant to be multi-generational. It encourages a healthy, thoughtful skepticism, kind of like the angels in the Quran who ask questions. It's designed to learn from all of human knowledge as it grows. And maybe the most powerful idea of all, it says there's no reason to think that the best scholars are all in the past. Who's to say the future won't produce even greater ones? And that really leaves us with a big, thought-provoking question to chew on. If our understanding of divine wisdom isn't set in stone, if it's actually meant to grow and deepen as we as a species learn and grow, then what's next? What new latent principles, what deeper truths will future generations uncover as they carry on this process of induction and illustration?